Honey is one of those ingredients most people think they already understand. There's a jar of it in the pantry, you squeeze some into tea, drizzle it on toast, maybe stir it into a salad dressing. It's honey. You know what it is. But honey isn't one thing. Depending on what flowers the bees visited, where in the world the hive sat, how the honey was handled after harvest, and what tree or insect was involved. And one type on this list does involve an insect in a way that surprises almost everyone. You get products so different in color, texture, flavor, and chemistry that it's genuinely hard to believe they all belong in the same category. This video goes through 10 of them. Raw honey. Raw honey is honey exactly as it comes out of the hive. No heat treatment, no fine filtration, no industrial processing of any kind. The color ranges from pale gold to deep amber, depending on what the bees visited, and it's usually slightly cloudy rather than clear. That cloudiness comes from microscopic particles of pollen, wax, and propolis, the resin-like material bees use to seal their hive, all suspended in the liquid. This is the version of honey humans have been eating for almost all of recorded history. Cave paintings in Spain, dating back roughly 8,000 years, show people climbing cliff faces to reach wild bee nests. Ancient Egyptians used honey as currency, offered it to their gods, and packed jars of it into tombs alongside the dead. When archaeologists opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, they found sealed honey jars that were still edible after roughly 3,000 years. Honey doesn't spoil because it contains very little water. It's quite acidic, and it produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide. Those three things together make it almost impossible for bacteria to grow. Somewhere during the 20th century, when honey production became industrial, manufacturers started heating honey to high temperatures so it would flow more easily through bottling machinery and filtering it very finely to achieve a clear, uniform look on store shelves. That process kills the naturally occurring yeasts, extends shelf life, and produces a consistent product. But it also destroys enzymes, removes most of the pollen, and strips out the active compounds that give honey its character. Raw honey is what remains when none of that has happened to it. One thing that trips people up about raw honey, it often crystallizes over time, turning from a smooth liquid into something thick and grainy. Many people assume it's gone bad or been adulterated with sugar. It hasn't. Crystallization is completely natural. The glucose in honey gradually forms solid crystals, while the fructose stays liquid. Heavily processed honey actually crystallizes less, because the heat treatment disrupts the crystal structure. A jar that stays perfectly liquid at room temperature for years is more likely to be highly processed than one that sets up over a few months. Raw honey works best in situations where you're not cooking it at high heat, stirred into warm tea, drizzled over yogurt or a cheese board, used in salad dressings, or eaten straight from the spoon. Baking with it is fine, but oven temperatures will reduce some of the active compounds that make it worth buying in the first place. Clover honey. Clover honey is the default. It's the honey in the plastic, bear-shaped squeeze bottle, the honey in the little paper packets at diners, the honey your grandmother kept in the cabinet without thinking twice about it. The flavor is clean and straightforwardly sweet, with almost no distinctive aftertaste. The color is light gold. It flows easily and behaves predictably in the kitchen. Clover itself isn't native to North America. European settlers brought it over in the 17th and 18th centuries as a forage crop for livestock, and as a way to improve depleted soil. Honeybees came with the settlers too. Both species spread across the continent together, and by the 19th century, white and red clover were covering millions of acres of American farmland, while honeybee colonies followed behind them. The combination was almost accidental, but it produced a honey so abundant and so mild that it became the baseline for what honey is supposed to taste like in the American market. Today, clover honey accounts for somewhere around 40 to 50% of all honey produced in the United States. Most of the generic, unlabeled honey on grocery store shelves is clover honey, often blended from multiple sources, filtered, and pasteurized into a consistent, shelf-stable product. The mild flavor isn't a flaw. It's what makes clover honey so useful. It sweetens without competing, which means it works in baking, in marinades, in vinaigrettes, in glazes, in tea, and in sauces, without pulling anything in a particular direction. When a recipe says 1 tablespoon of honey, without specifying a type, it almost always means clover honey, the one that stays out of the way. Acacia honey. Acacia honey looks like it shouldn't exist. It's nearly water clear, barely tinted with the palest possible yellow. Holding a jar up to a window, it looks less like honey and more like very lightly colored glass. The flavor is delicate, a clean, light sweetness, with a faint floral note that fades quickly and leaves almost no aftertaste at all. It's the most understated honey there is. Despite the name, most acacia honey sold in European and American markets doesn't actually come from a true acacia tree. It comes from the black locust, Robinia pseudoacacia, a tree originally from the Appalachian region of eastern North America that was introduced to Europe in the 1600s and spread so successfully across Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria that those countries became its largest producers. Hungary alone exports enormous quantities every year. The chemistry behind acacia honey's appearance and behavior comes down to one thing. It has an unusually high ratio of fructose to glucose, roughly 40% fructose against 35% glucose. Because fructose crystallizes much more slowly than glucose does, acacia honey can stay fully liquid at room temperature for months, sometimes years, without setting up. In restaurants and cafes, that's a real practical advantage. A jar left on a table doesn't turn into a solid block that has to be heated before use. Because the flavor is so light, acacia honey is the right choice for situations where you want honey sweetness, without the honey taste taking over the whole thing. It dissolves cleanly into tea or coffee, without changing the color of the drink. It's good over fresh ricotta or yogurt. In Eastern European households, acacia honey spread thick on white bread for breakfast is a tradition that goes back many generations. Buckwheat honey. Buckwheat honey is the opposite of acacia honey in almost every way. It's dark. Some jars are so dark they look nearly black. The smell is strong and earthy, somewhere between malt, soil, and molasses. The flavor is bold and complex, with a bitterness at the end that lingers. The sweetness is there, but it's not the first thing you notice. First-time tasters often pause for a moment, because this doesn't match anyone's mental picture of what honey is supposed to be. Buckwheat is a crop that grows fast, tolerates poor soil, and requires very little to produce a good yield. It was a staple on American farms in the 18th and 19th centuries, and buckwheat honey was common and widely eaten. Then, during the 20th century, industrial agriculture shifted toward high-yield corn and wheat varieties. Buckwheat fell out of regular rotation on most American farms, and the honey largely disappeared with it. What exists today comes primarily from smaller operations in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ontario, and it's now treated as a specialty product, something deliberately sought out rather than grabbed off the shelf. The deep color is connected directly to what makes buckwheat honey nutritionally different from lighter varieties. As a general rule in honey, darker color correlates with higher antioxidant content. Buckwheat honey consistently ranks at or near the top when researchers measure antioxidant concentration across honey types. A 2004 study published in the Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine found that a single dose of buckwheat honey was as effective as dextromethorphan, the active ingredient in standard over-the-counter cough syrup, at reducing nighttime cough frequency and severity in children. Not more effective, equally effective. Without any side effect. In the kitchen, the intensity of buckwheat honey is an asset when paired with things that can hold their own against it. It works well in marinades for pork or beef, stirred into oatmeal, or spread on dark rye bread. In Russia and Ukraine, buckwheat honey is the most common everyday honey. It shows up alongside buckwheat porridge and cottage cheese pancakes, the way clover honey shows up alongside biscuits in the American South. Manuka honey. Manuka honey is thick, darker than clover honey but lighter than buckwheat, and the texture is closer to soft butter than to the runny honey most people are used to. The flavor is earthy and slightly herbal, with a bitterness underneath the sweetness. It doesn't taste like what most people expect honey to taste like. People either take to it quickly or find it requires some adjustment. It comes from the Manuka plant, Leptospermum scoparium, a flowering shrub native to New Zealand and parts of southeastern Australia. The Maori people of New Zealand had been using the bark and leaves of the Manuka in traditional medicine for a long time before anyone paid attention to the honey. That changed in the 1980s, when biochemist Peter Molen at the University of Waikato began studying the antibacterial properties of New Zealand honeys and found that Manuka honey had an unusually strong antimicrobial activity, one that couldn't be explained by hydrogen peroxide alone, which is the compound responsible for antibacterial properties in ordinary honey. The reason turned out to be methylglyoxal, or MgO. All honey contains trace amounts of MgO, but Manuka honey contains it at concentrations sometimes hundreds of times higher. The MgO develops from dihydroxyacetone, a compound found at high levels in Manuka flower nectar, which converts to MgO as the honey cures. Because MgO is chemically stable in ways that hydrogen peroxide is not, Manuka honey's antibacterial properties don't degrade when exposed to heat or light. Some hospital wound care products use Manuka honey as an active ingredient for treating infections that haven't responded to antibiotics. The antibacterial strength is rated on labels using a UMF scale, unique Manuka factor, or directly as an MgO concentration. UMF 10+, or MgO 263+, are ratings that indicate meaningful activity. The price reflects the reputation. Small jars commonly run from $30 to well over $100. Here's the part that complicates everything. New Zealand produces roughly 1,700 metric tons of genuine Manuka honey per year. Global sales of products labeled as Manuka honey run to around 10,000 metric tons annually. The math doesn't work. A UK Food Standards Agency report concluded that the majority of Manuka honey sold internationally is either diluted, mislabeled, or not Manuka honey at all. Estimates suggest that 4 out of 5 jars sold globally as Manuka honey are not the real thing. The high price tag makes the incentive for fraud very large. The real product is used in small amounts, a spoonful dissolved in hot water with lemon and ginger, applied directly to a small wound, or taken straight. Cooking it at high heat destroys the MgO, which defeats the entire point of buying it. Tupelo honey. Tupelo honey is pale amber, with a faint greenish tint that you can see when you hold the jar to a window. It pours very slowly, thick and smooth, and the flavor is unusually delicate for a honey this color. Light, floral, with a soft, buttery quality and a sweetness that doesn't leave the sticky finish a lot of honey does. People who try it for the first time are often surprised by how gentle it is. It comes from one specific tree, the white ogeechee tupelo, Nyssa ogeechee, that grows in the river swamps of the Florida Panhandle and a narrow strip of southern Georgia, the Apalachicola, Choctawhatchee, and Ochlockonee rivers. That's the entire range. The tree blooms for 2 to 3 weeks in April, and that 2 to 3 week window is the only opportunity beekeepers get to collect tupelo honey for the entire year. A cold snap at the wrong time, too much rain during bloom, or a late spring can cut the harvest to almost nothing. Beekeepers who work tupelo honey don't pull up to a field, drop their hives, and drive home. The tupelo trees grow with their roots standing in swamp water. There is no dry ground. Beekeepers load hives onto flat-bottomed boats, push into the swamp, and set the hives on wooden platforms nailed between cypress trees or on floating barges. They do this every spring, then retrieve the hives and the honey a few weeks later. It's a tradition passed down through families along the Panhandle for generations, and the number of people still doing it is getting smaller every decade. Tupelo honey has an exceptionally high fructose content, around 44%, which is what keeps it from crystallizing. A jar of genuine Tupelo honey can sit at room temperature for years and stay completely liquid. That stability is also one of the ways beekeepers and buyers verify authenticity. If a honey sold as tupelo crystallizes, it almost certainly has been blended with another honey. In 1971, Van Morrison named his album Tupelo Honey, widely considered one of the warmest records in rock history, full of tenderness and ease. The name wasn't random. Morrison was reaching for something that described a particular sweetness, a softness of feeling that he couldn't convey with just any word. The album landed on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Tupelo honey works best where you can actually taste it. On a warm biscuit, on cornbread, stirred into sweet tea. It's too fine a flavor to cook away. Orange blossom honey. Orange blossom honey is pale, nearly white in some varieties, or a very light golden yellow. It's clear and on the thinner side compared to most honeys. The smell is what identifies it immediately. A soft, sweet floral fragrance with a slight citrus brightness to it. You can recognize it before you taste it. The flavor follows the same line, mild, lightly citrusy, with a clean finish that doesn't linger too long. It comes from citrus groves, primarily orange trees, though grapefruit and lemon blossoms contribute in areas where they're grown nearby. The main production regions are Florida and California in the United States, and Spain, which supplies a large share of what the European market sees. The relationship between orange growers and beekeepers in Florida is one of the older agricultural partnerships in the American South. Beekeepers truck hives to citrus groves each spring when the orange trees bloom, not just to produce honey, but primarily to pollinate the crop. Orange trees can self-pollinate to some extent, but bee-pollinated trees set fruit more reliably and produce more juice. Many growers pay beekeepers to bring hives in. The honey is, in a sense, a byproduct of a service the beekeeper is already providing. Florida's citrus industry has shrunk substantially since the 1990s, hit by citrus greening disease, a bacterial infection spread by an invasive insect that gradually kills trees, along with hurricane damage and pressure from real estate development. Less citrus acreage means fewer blossoms and less honey. Florida orange blossom honey, specifically, is harder to find and more expensive than it once was. The lightness of the flavor makes it versatile in the kitchen without being complicated about it. It dissolves into chamomile or green tea without changing the character of the drink. It's good, drizzled over goat cheese or ricotta with some fresh fruit. It pairs well with buttery pastry, a warm croissant, a good scone. It also works in salad dressings, where you want a citrus note without adding actual citrus juice. Honeydew. Honeydew honey does not come from flowers. Every other honey on this list starts with bees visiting a blossom, collecting nectar, and carrying it back to the hive. Honeydew honey starts somewhere different. It starts with insects, specifically aphids and scale insects, small bugs that pierce the bark or leaf tissue of trees, draw out the sap, digest what they need, and excrete the rest as a sugary liquid that coats the leaves and branches. That liquid is called honeydew. Bees collect it the same way they collect flower nectar, bring it back to the hive, and process it through the same enzymatic and evaporation process. Honeydew honey is made from the excreted waste of sap-sucking insects. That description is the part most people need a moment with. The honey itself doesn't reflect its origin in any way that tastes off or unpleasant. It simply tastes very different from flower honey. The color is deep brown to near black, with a dark reddish or greenish tint when held to light. The texture is thick and slow-moving. The flavor is rich and resinous, slightly woody, with notes of caramel, and a mild bitterness that's reminiscent of molasses, but without the sharpness. The sweetness sits lower than in most flower honeys. In Germany, Tannenhonig, fir tree honeydew honey, produced in the Black Forest, is considered the most prized and expensive honey made domestically. In Greece, pine honeydew honey accounts for more than 65% of total national honey production, and Greek beekeepers and consumers widely regard it as the best honey in the world. These countries have been producing and eating honeydew honey for centuries. The origin isn't remarkable to anyone who grew up with it. The mineral content of honeydew honey is measurably higher than in flower honeys, and it contains higher levels of oligosaccharides, which act as prebiotics. Antioxidant levels are comparable to buckwheat honey, significantly higher than in light honeys like acacia or clover. In the kitchen, it pairs well with aged cheeses, Gouda, Emmental, Gruyere, and with dark breads, gingerbread, and marinades for game meat. Creamed honey. Creamed honey is white or pale ivory, smooth enough to spread with a butter knife and thick enough to hold its shape on a piece of toast without running. It dissolves on the tongue almost immediately in a way that liquid honey doesn't. People who haven't seen it before often assume it must have cream or butter mixed in, or that it's some kind of honey-flavored spread that isn't actually honey. It is entirely honey. No cream, no butter, no thickener, no added ingredients of any kind. The difference is purely physical. All honey crystallizes over time. The glucose in it gradually forms solid crystals, while the fructose stays liquid. When that happens naturally and without any control, the crystals that form are large and irregular, and the texture ends up grainy and coarse, which most people find unpleasant. Creamed honey is the result of controlling that process deliberately. The technique was worked out in 1928 by Elton J.D. Dice, a food scientist at Cornell University. Dice found that if you take a small quantity of honey that has already formed very fine, uniform crystals and stir it into a large batch of liquid honey as a starter, similar in principle to how you start a sourdough with existing culture, then hold the whole batch at a cool, stable temperature while stirring it continuously. The crystals that form throughout will all be microscopic and evenly distributed. The resulting texture is smooth, consistent, and stable. That method is still the basis for how creamed honey is made commercially today. It's called the Dice process. Creamed honey is extremely common in Canada. Common enough that many Canadians grow up thinking of the creamed version as simply honey and find liquid honey a little unexpected. It's also standard in parts of Northern Europe. In the United States, liquid honey is the norm, and creamed honey tends to get marketed as a specialty item, even though the underlying product has been around since the late 1920s. It's practically useful in situations where liquid honey would be inconvenient. It stays where you put it on toast or a biscuit, without dripping off the edge. It stirs smoothly into oatmeal without splashing. It incorporates into buttercream frostings and icings without adding unwanted moisture. The flavor is identical to whatever honey was used to make it. Creaming doesn't change the taste, only the texture. Sidr honey. Sidr honey is amber to golden brown, clear, and pours in a slow, smooth stream. The fragrance is rich and layered. Caramel, dried fruit, and something that reads as warm and almost buttery. The flavor follows the same profile. Deeply sweet, complex, long finishing, with none of the sharpness that can make some strong honeys difficult to appreciate. Tasters consistently describe it as unusually smooth or refined, even compared to other premium honeys. It comes from the Sidr tree, Ziziphus spina Christi, a thorny, drought-resistant tree that has grown across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East for thousands of years. In Yemen, the most prized Sidr honey comes from trees in the Hadramaut region and the Wadi Doan Valley, remote, high-walled river valleys between limestone plateaus in the south of the country. The trees there grow largely undisturbed, and bees working them are mostly wild or semi-wild colonies. The harvest happens once a year, in autumn. The Sidr tree is mentioned in the Quran. Surah An-Nahl, the chapter of the bee, describes honey as a healing substance, and in Islamic traditional medicine, honey from the Sidr tree carries particular significance. It has been valued as both a food and a medicine in the Arab world for well over 1,000 years. Presenting Sidr honey as a gift in Gulf and Yemeni culture carries a meaning that goes beyond the honey itself. It communicates respect, care, and a certain seriousness of intention. The price reflects the combination of scarcity, labor, and cultural weight. Genuine Yemeni Sidr honey sells for 200 to 300 US dollars per kilogram on international markets. In Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, premium lots from beekeepers with a known reputation command prices well above that. It is consistently one of the most expensive honeys produced anywhere in the world. The situation for the people producing it is much harder than the price suggests. Yemen has been in a civil war since 2015, one of the most severe humanitarian crises currently active anywhere. Beekeepers in rural southern Yemen have lost hives to bombing, have been displaced from the land they worked, and in many areas can no longer safely reach the valleys where the Sidr trees grow. At the same time, international demand has been increasing, driven by the specialty food market and by cultural and religious significance in Muslim communities globally. The honey is reaching record prices at the moment that the people producing it are least equipped to benefit from it. Sidr honey is most often eaten simply, dissolved in warm water and drunk in the morning, or taken by the spoonful. It appears in certain traditional Yemeni and Gulf preparations and in some Middle Eastern desserts. Because of what it costs and what it means, most people who have it use it carefully, in small amounts, in ways where the flavor is fully present, rather than cooked away into something else.